Welcome to the Exam Room Podcast, brought to you by the Physicians Committee. Hello, I am the weight loss champion, Chuck Carroll. Thank you so very much for raising your health IQ with us in more than 130 countries around the world, making the Exam Room one of the most consumed nutrition podcasts anywhere on the planet today. And today we are going to be speaking with a gentleman who, in addition to being the co-founder and CEO of Health Revolution, he is also an author. He is the host of his own podcast called Healing is Possible. How great is that name? He is also an emergency room physician, which means that this gentleman has the opportunity to reach people when they are at perhaps their lowest point and looking for change. And maybe they don't think that change is possible, but as his title of the podcast suggests, healing is in fact possible. And so I am so thrilled today to be welcoming that gentleman to the show, Dr. Anoop Kumar, to the Exam Room. Thank you so very much for being here, my friend.
Thank you, Chuck. It's great to be here. Looking forward to speaking with you.
I want to dive right in and talk about your work as an emergency room physician, because this is what really strikes me, is that when people change, they kind of need to reach that rock bottom first before anything else can be done. They need to be at their absolute worst at rock bottom. You see that when they come into the emergency room. Even though your time with them is somewhat limited because they then get passed off or they're discharged, do you feel like you're able to reach them and really kind of plant the seed for change?
Certainly because of the intensity of the suffering that can happen in the ER, and because people often are worried about their life in general and not just a minor pain or an ache. Because of that, yes, it is possible to reach people. And I think it begins with, telling them about their diagnosis, telling them about the options, but also suggesting those other things that we don't usually talk about in healthcare. Food, right? So fundamental to living, so fundamental to life, but we don't talk about it a lot. So talking about food, talking about what I call nutrition, talking about movement, talking about connection, rest. Now, I don't go through the whole litany of things, but wherever there's an opportunity to mention one thing, yes, I take that opportunity. I think of one case in particular, this was many years ago, about a person who came in with severe chest pain. And we did the full workup, and I was worried about what we would find. And fortunately, it was not one of the major life-threatening conditions that we would diagnose. Now, it wasn't a major heart attack, it wasn't a tear in the aorta, it wasn't a massive pneumonia, it wasn't those things, but there was still something happening. His pain was real, his distress was real. It was a signal that something was happening. He still probably had heart disease that had not become a heart attack, but still it was a relief to say that, okay, it hasn't yet crossed that threshold where it is immediately life-threatening, right? And so that was an opportunity to talk to him and say, I let out a breath of fresh air and said, look, it's not this, but there's something happening and it's time to take a look at these. And his wife was there and we had a conversation. So sometimes those opportunities are there, and those are wonderful times to open up a new perspective.
Is it at all frustrating to you knowing that, I've seen estimates anywhere between 80 to 95% of chronic diseases can absolutely be prevented based off of diet and lifestyle changes, which we will be getting into today with your mind-body flow theory, which is absolutely phenomenal. Is it frustrating to you to see so many people come in when they absolutely positively did not necessarily have to be there?
Chuck, it's not just frustrating, it's painful. That's why I'm doing this. That's why I'm on the show. That's why we're creating Health Revolution. That's why the Healing is Possible podcast exists. It's painful for me to see people day in and day out come in with conditions that they've never been told how to manage differently, right? It's not even that people don't want to listen, right? Of course, yes, some things can be difficult. Sometimes people don't want to listen. But that's not the major factor. The major factor is we physicians, we are not spending time training in this ourselves. We're not spending time talking to our patients. We're not spending time out in the community, right? There should be massive advocacy about nutrition, movement, connection, and rest. This stuff reverses disease. And when it doesn't, ultimately downstream, it shows up in the ER. And yes, it's painful and we need to do something about it. And that's why I'm here.
I saw a study recently that examined how people would rate their diet. Do you think it's a healthy diet? Do you think it's a poor diet? And the results were absolutely fascinating to me. And what it showed was that people really have no idea whether or not their diet is healthy. So, what they did was, I mean, they had just like thousands of people fill out this questionnaire and basically food journal and write down what it was that they were eating and what their opinion was on these foods. The vast majority overestimated how healthy their diet was, and not by a small margin either. I mean, we are talking like a very, very wide margin. Ironically, though, the group that was most accurate in being able to discern whether or not they had an unhealthy diet was the group who thought they had an unhealthy diet. As a
Yep.
matter of fact, when the nutritionists looked at this, nearly across the board, when somebody would say, "Yeah, I'm eating a poor diet," they sure as heck were. But that was only a small percentage of the people who participated. So, where do you think we're going wrong in terms of really educating ourselves as a society in terms of what is and is not healthy?
One way we're going wrong is marketing, to be frank. And one way we're going wrong is looking at the wrong endpoint. Okay, and let me take the second one first. Looking at the wrong endpoint. The endpoint we should be looking at is, does healing happen, or did healing happen? Yes or no. Period. All right. If it's no, then whatever this person is doing is not working. And now, of course, it's multifactorial, so we'll have to isolate the different things that they're doing. But if we isolated diet, isolated nutrition, and we're looking at what they're eating, then the endpoint is, does it work, does it not? And right now, that's not the endpoint, right? Right now, the endpoint is, do symptoms kind of get better, right? Or are we doing just what the doctor says? And that is not enough. If you look at the people on the Healing is Possible podcast, right? If you look at Jacqueline, who healed from Crohn's disease, or you look at Jimmy, who healed from heart disease. Jimmy's story is amazing because he's an orthopedic surgeon who woke up on the table and his surgeon was looking over him saying, you need a bypass surgery or you're going to die, essentially, right? He had never heard about plant-based food being a solution to this. In fact, he himself said that he would laugh at people who were eating plant-based and say that they were crazy, or it wasn't going to work. Well, he switched and he reversed his heart disease. He's symptom-free, never had surgery, didn't have stents, nothing like that. And he's off of all medications, right? So the endpoint should be that. So what did Jimmy do? He was plant-based, right? He cut out oil. If you look at the programs that reverse heart disease, right? Stents don't reverse heart disease. Coronary artery bypass surgery does not reverse heart disease. Cholesterol medicine does not reverse heart disease. Blood pressure medicine does not reverse heart disease. Plant-based diets have been shown to reverse heart disease. So that is the endpoint we should be looking at, not just some symptom relief, not only what the books say. I'm not saying to throw out what the books say. Let's look at that, but let's have the right endpoint in mind, which is long-term sustained healing and independence of the person, not dependence on something else so that I have to feel better temporarily, right? That's number one.
Yeah.
Number two, what I said is marketing, right? So obviously there are huge interests vested in making us think that a large plate of pasta with a few spoons of olive oil and a couple turkey meatballs is healthy, as compared to a large plate of pasta and, let's say, beef meatballs and, let's say, some other oil, cooking with some other oil. And what we're talking about is such slight differences when it comes to, let's take heart disease, for example, right? The difference between those two plates of food for somebody who has heart disease is not nearly the same as the difference between one of those plates and another plate, which is pasta with mostly fresh vegetables and no oil, right? That's a vast difference. But marketing plays a factor, right? In terms of keeping certain foods being sold, certain medications being sold, and even our own services as physicians, right? To have our own procedures be needed, we need people who are eating those kinds of plates of food too. So both of those factors play a role.
Yeah. Pro tip, by the way, you were just talking about pasta. One of the things that I like to do to maximize nutrition is, even if I'm eating like a really clean store-bought brand of pasta sauce on top of the pasta, I always add vegetables to it, whether that's fresh spinach or even sometimes frozen spinach. I'll heat that up with that in there. I'll always add broccoli in there for whatever reason, and whatever other vegetable I have. It's just like piling it on to make sure that you get those nutrients. So it's, you know, you're always getting, as my mom would say growing up, make sure there's something green on your plate. And it's like
Yeah.
little things like that, honestly, that I feel today can make an enormous difference. And when you're talking about making small changes like that, as a physician, would you agree that that small change can actually be a big step in a healthier direction?
That small change makes a huge difference. It makes it, I mean, the research is there. If you look at the research at what reverses heart disease, at what helps with inflammation, almost most of the people or many of the people on the podcast have switched to or have shown the importance of a plant-based diet. And it helps with not just heart disease. They might be looking at heart disease, that might be their primary concern, but guess what? They notice their headaches get better. You know, they notice that their aches and pains are better. They notice that their mood is better. They notice that they can come down off of other medications. So, you know, in the case of plant-based diet, many of the side effects are good side effects. So yes, making something that looks like a small change. And by the way, I agree with you. You know, in some of the food I ate growing up, we would have a lot of rice, and then we would have, you know, the side dishes. And what I do now in those cases, I reverse it. So it's small amount of rice, and then it's a ton of fresh fruits and vegetables around it.
Yeah, you know, and I told this story also recently on the show, but it's profound, so I like to share it as often as possible. And that is, I was with somebody going out to eat recently, and you know, big salad, and they said, "Well, look, you know, if I eat all of this salad, I'm not going to be ready for when my entree comes." And the entree was this big old plate of lasagna, which had like 18 layers of cheese on there. It had some ground meat in there, really just a high calorie, high fat dish that's not going to do a whole lot to serve their body in terms of nutrition. And I remember like stopping at that moment and thinking, man, you know, back in the day, I would have thought the exact same thing. But now I'm like, you need to invert that, even though obviously I'm eating an exclusively plant-based diet and wouldn't order the same entree that that person did. Now I'm all about that salad. I'm all about stuffing myself with as many fresh fruits and vegetables as possible. And then if there's room left over, add a little bit something, something on top of that. That's
Yeah.
another, you know, trick that you can do with your mind to really get yourself going in a
Yeah.
better direction too.
Yeah, and one of the things I want to say about the plant-based diet is like, and many people think like you did and think like I did. I also used to eat the same kind of food, and one thing that we have to realize is that when we first make that change, the taste buds are not used to it, right? The mind is not used to it. It's used to that a different kind of jolt that happens with the usual kinds of foods. But the key to keep in mind is like, where do I want to be 6 months from now? Where do I want to be a year from now? Where do I want to be 5 years from now? Right? That's the motivating factor. And yes, it might not taste the same in the beginning, but after a few weeks, everything gets reorganized, right? And I'm sure you experience this. All the circuits change. What tastes good changes, so that it's not like you have to force yourself to eat this stuff. It's that you're like, wow, my body feels amazing. My mind has never been so clear. My energy levels are up. And oh, by the way, my Crohn's disease is improving, or my heart disease has gone away. You know, so keep in mind that we're talking about sticking with it for a few weeks until that circuitry changes and we're starting to see the difference.
So you just said that you weren't always this way, right? You didn't always eat the plant-based diet. When did your philosophy toward medicine begin to shift?
Well, you know, the my philosophy towards life in general was different even as a kid. My family was into ancient Indian philosophy when I was a child, which looks at the integration of the human being and nature and the universe, the cosmos, right? It looks at all this as a complete system. And that was my perspective. And I was always kind of experimenting with that in my life. And by the time I got to medical school, I saw how we were looking at the human being, and frankly, not the human being, the human body, right? We make this mistake in medicine today, in allopathic medicine, where we believe that the human body can stand in for the human being, and it can't. All right. The human body is an aspect of the human being. And if we think that we can address just that and be able to cure the diseases we want to cure, or even treat the diseases we want to treat, or even diagnose what is happening completely, we're sorely mistaken. So that was obvious to me when I entered medical school. And then in my 20s, I went through a great deal of change in my perspective, the way I saw things. It was just a tremendous transformational period in my time, in my life. And then what I realized is I had to make these changes, right? It was very obvious to me. I was in residency and I was eating pizza and wings and all kinds of stuff, right? And Snickers bars. And at the end of this, after I finished my training, moved back home and started working. And then I realized that, wow, I really need to make some changes so that I myself can go through this transformation that was happening in my life and still see clearly and be able to function in the way I do. And that's where the 4 engines that I talk about come from: nutrition, movement, connection, rest. That's where the plant-based diet came from. I went cold turkey, just went completely to plant-based. And it felt as if my body were just saying, thank you, thank you, thank you. And it felt as if a complete fog lifted out of the mind and everything became crystal clear, everything became easier. And that's how I started doing the plant-based diet.
And that's the perfect segue into what you call the it's one of the greatest titles I've heard, the mind body flow theory, which just sounds absolutely amazing. I think that you just described it pretty well there, but let's go a little bit more in depth in there, because there are a lot of layers to that onion, as I like to say. So if somebody comes up to you, Dr. Kumar, and they say, "Hey, that's a really cool title, but what exactly is it that you're talking about with this theory?"
Mind-body flow theory essentially says that what we call the body is the flow of the mind, just as what we call a river is the flow of water, right? So if you want to change a river, what do? You don't say, let me do this to the river, let me do that to the river as a whole. You say, let me look at the water that is constituting the river. Let me look at the streams that are forming the river. When I change the streams and I change the water, the river automatically changes. Similarly, when we work on the mind, when we address factors in the mind, the body automatically changes. In other words, the idea we have now in medicine that the mind and body are 2 different things, the idea that we have that we can somehow see and understand and treat a human being without understanding mind completely, is completely erroneous. And I'll give you an example. Jacqueline is one of the cases, one of the people who told us her story on the Healing is Possible podcast. And she had Crohn's disease for decades, right? Abdominal pain, bloating, bowel obstructions, in the ER, admitted to the hospital year after year, even had bowel resection, removal of part of her bowel. Tried everything. She tried everything, including food even, changing her food. Nothing worked until she had a 90-minute hypnosis session and never had a symptom again. And she had a repeat colonoscopy that was normal. Now, you might think this is wild, this is uncommon. No, over and over and over, I hear such stories. And there's no way to explain this story. In fact, her gastroenterologist said, I wouldn't believe this if I didn't hear it myself, if I didn't see it myself. There's no way to explain this story using the current idea in medicine that mind and body are different, or that mind is not important, or that the body is sufficient stand-in for the human being. None of that flies, right? So what we're forced to do in medicine is say, well, that's an anomaly. Well, that's supernatural. Well, that's spirituality. Well, that's strange. No, it's none of those. It's just our ignorance. And so mind-body flow theory steps in and says, whoa, 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 whoa. You can't look at a human being as just a body. That body that you see is like the dense aspect of the mind. Just like when you see a river, what you're seeing is actually the flow of water. And so when we attend to the mind completely, we can change the body. And this is when all kinds of healing happens that we believe is not possible based on a purely physicalist and dualist model.
So that kind of makes me wonder. I think that a lot of times there are, groups of people who are really dug in, and they're either on one side or the other. They're all in for, healthcare kind of as we know it, at least the treatment model as we know it. And then there's the lifestyle exclusive group. And how do you as a physician kind of balance between the two? What is the modern mix between or what is the proper mix between modern medicine and preventative medicine? Should that model be kind of inverted, as opposed to, where we're at now, where it's like, well, now you got the problem, let's treat it. So how would you invert
Right.
it? How should they coexist?
So this question reminds me of how we think about what we call complementary medicine, right? And the whole idea and the way we think about complementary medicine is upside down and on its head. And this is what I mean. We believe today that pills and surgery is primary medicine, and everything else is secondary medicine, right? Everything else is complementary, right? Pills and surgery first, and then everything else is complementary. This is complementary medicine. And when we talk about integrative medicine, we're talking about integrating this primary pills and surgery with complementary medicine. It's all backwards, it's all upside down, it's all on its head. In fact, what is primary is nutrition, movement, connection, and rest. It doesn't matter what system you're in. It doesn't matter what culture you're in. It doesn't matter if you lived 2,000 years ago or you'll be living 2,000 years from now. Primary medicine, healing, and health are always about nutrition, movement, connection, and rest. These four engines. Start these four engines and healing starts to happen. Secondary medicine or complementary medicine is everything else. It's pills and surgery and everything else. So next time you hear complementary medicine, just reason with yourself and then reason with the person in front of you and just say, you know what, I think you got it backwards. Pills and surgery are complementary medicine. If we're not starting with nutrition, movement, connection, and rest, we're not using nearly the full power of the human organism, of the human system to heal.
Well, and for me, it kind of simplifies even further. I mean, I would just boil it down to I think you can tell anybody, like, well, why would you want to have a problem in the first place? And they would be able to understand what it was you were talking about, right? Why
Right.
get to the point where you would need pills? Why get to the point where you would need surgery? Why get to the point
Right.
where you're faced with years of battling a chronic illness? And we know that that's not fun. And as we said at the top of the show, I mean, you're talking about in excess of 80% of cases of chronic illnesses that are completely preventable. So why get to that point? That's the big question. And
Yeah,
that's why I love doing the show. And I'm sure why you love doing what it is that you do through your books, through the Healing is Possible podcast, through
absolutely.
Health Revolution, is to educate people that, healing is possible. And in fact, getting to the point where you don't even have anything to heal
Yeah,
is also possible. To me, that
absolutely.
is just the most powerful and incredible thing, and why I love doing this show so very much. One of the things I know that you also talk about that just absolutely fascinates me, Dr. Kumar, is that when it comes to actually being able to say what the true prognosis for an illness is,
Yeah.
we really don't know. And it took me a minute to really kind of get what it was you were talking about. But talk to the exam roomies
Yeah.
about this. This is kind of a new thing. So what are we talking about here?
All right. So this was new even to me, right? Like I said, I was brought up in a particular environment. I was open to different kinds of ideas. I was doing all that. I've been in the ER. But when I started to do this Healing is Possible podcast, when I started talking to people, this dawned on me, right? People are coming out of left field. People are coming out of the woodwork. People are coming to me from all over the place saying, oh, and I healed from this. Oh, and I healed from this. Oh, and this happened. Oh, then this happened. And so what's dawning on me, and this is stuff that's not supposed to get better without treatment, right? This is stuff like some cancers. This is stuff like multiple sclerosis. This is stuff like severe heart disease. This is stuff like severe ulcerative colitis, severe Crohn's disease, and on, right? This is stuff like what we call schizophrenia. This is stuff like just on and on and on. Stuff that is not supposed to get better on its own. Stuff that is not supposed to be so-called cured or healed, which is a word that we don't really use, gets better in case after case after case. And in most of these cases, Chuck, in the vast majority of these cases, when I ask these people, so what did your physician say? Many times it is, I don't know how it happened, or it's you didn't really have that diagnosis to begin with, right? You couldn't have had the diagnosis because you healed from it, and my book says you're not allowed to heal from it, or healing doesn't happen like that, right? So What's happening is, and did they write it up in a medical journal? Almost certainly not. A few times, but almost certainly not. So what is happening is the number of cases of healing of heart disease and schizophrenia and cancers and multiple sclerosis and so on are not showing up in medical journals, and therefore they're not in medical textbooks, and therefore they're not in the curriculum. So when we talk about prognosis, do we really know what the prognosis is for these conditions if we're not capturing these? And furthermore, think about this. How many people really want their story out there on YouTube? How many people really want to talk about one of the most difficult times of their life to billions of people, right? Very few people. So even that number that we are hearing about, where we're saying, wow, not only is healing is possible, healing is happening all around us. Even the number that's making us feel that way is a vast underestimation of the number of people who are actually healing. So do we really know what the prognosis is for heart disease if we're not accounting for this? I don't think we do. And that's a destabilizing thought to me as a physician.
So how do we get to a point where your colleagues in medicine could become more comfortable writing about these cases that they feel are anomalies? I'll give you a specific instance here that tells me that you're spot on. Is I know that a number of the studies that we have published at the Physicians Committee, anecdotal ones, as a matter of fact, will get published, and then suddenly, the lead researcher here will hear from scores of physicians and maybe even a few patients from around the world who say, this was me too. So what can we do to encourage others to really make sure that those stories do in fact get told?
Well, frankly, I think the best way is what we're doing. It's you talking about it. It's you publishing studies. It's me talking about it. I think it's a big part of it is physicians creating a space to say this is okay. And maybe that sounds crazy to the general public, and it shouldn't, but that's true. The fact is, we are experts in a particular kind of medicine and in a particular philosophy, by the way, right? We don't formally learn philosophy, but we informally learn a very strong physical-based philosophy about life, medicine, and healing throughout society, and it gets reinforced in medical school. And what we need to do is have people say, you know what, we can be science-based. We can have strong science, and we can question our philosophical assumptions. We can question whether our model of anatomy is incomplete. The model of anatomy has been updated over the years, right? As we discovered more and more about anatomy, we updated it. Well, at some point, we can ask a question and say, where is mind in this picture? Do we really still believe that mind is this little poof of clouds like we saw in our cartoons when we were kids that kind of puffs out from the brain? Frankly, yes, we still believe that in medical school. That's the state of our philosophical understanding and inquiry right now. And we need to create a safe space to say, we can be science-based and we can also question this and we can move into this area that we do not know in order to serve our patients better. So I'm hoping that having these conversations will create safe spaces for physicians to say that there are physicians out there and there are committees out there like the organization you're with that are working on this and that make it safe to help care for our patients better.
Hey man, I love that answer. I'm gonna clip that and play it back on loop. Get fired up every day, man. And my final question to you is this, because you used the word expert, and I know that you define that a little bit differently than a lot of other people would. So, to you, what does define an expert?
This goes back to what you just said about what I said about creating the safe space. We are experts in a particular philosophy, in a particular kind of medicine, which is biomedical medicine. And we need to know that that's not the only way to be an expert, right? What people need, what people are looking for is healing, which can include treatment, which can include cure, but it's not only about that. They're looking for a more complete experience, which includes those things. And so we have to come to terms with the fact that we physicians are not the only experts on healing. Like it might sound obvious, but I think we're scared of admitting that. And to me, an expert is someone who has been through this process. That is such a key aspect of healing. If I'm having my donut and pasta at every physician conference, and then I'm trying to talk about nutrition, it's just not going to work. It's at best it's theoretical. But somebody like Jimmy Conway, who was at death's door by his own accord and went through this incredibly harrowing experience of having to decide between surgery, he is a surgeon himself, having to decide between surgery and something that sounds so outlandish to him as a plant-based diet, and yet made that change, experienced dramatic results, not only with his heart disease, but many areas of his life. To me, that is a type of expertise that just goes above and beyond, and that kind of expertise in healthcare today, in the allopathic system today, is not recognized, right? That is considered alternative, which is just mind-boggling. That has to be primary. Someone who has healed and has experienced that and understands the power of nutrition, movement, connection, rest, and mind-body flow theory, that is a tremendous amount of expertise, which is what society needs, in addition to the complementary expertise of pills and procedures.
3 things that you need to do. A little bit of homework. Number 1 is fire up Instagram and go ahead and follow this account at Healthy Revol, as in revolution. So REVOL, Healthy Revol. Also, go bookmark this page right now, healthrevolution.org, and then fire up Apple Podcast or Spotify. Matter of fact, wherever it is that you're listening to this podcast, and look for the Healing is Possible podcast and subscribe and follow to that as well. My friend, it has been an absolute delight to have you here. I wish that there were more physicians like you in the world. So keep on getting this message far and wide, and trust that you are making an enormous difference in the lives of everyone who, I don't want to say is fortunate enough to cross paths with you in the ER, because frankly, who wants to be there? But I mean, I can't think of a better ER to have landed in than yours, my friend.
Thank you, Chuck. I appreciate it. And thanks everybody for listening.
If your health IQ is a couple of points higher than it was a few minutes ago, go ahead and like this video or subscribe to the YouTube channel. And to take it even higher, head over to Apple Podcast or wherever you get your favorite shows. Look for The Exam Room by the Physicians Committee. Hit the subscribe button there as well, and help to make your world a healthier place.